The number of Americans who say they don't identify with any particular religious belief is rapidly growing. So, what does this demographic mean for public debates about the role of faith and religious freedom?
We're showing by our actions that same kind of thought of that faith can make not just you, but our entire society and our community better.
On this episode, we profile new survey research exploring what the growing group of religiously unaffiliated actually think about religion in public life today, and surprising findings about which messages actually change their mind for the better. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week I'm happy to have back in our virtual studio Sam Abrams, friend of the show. Sam, welcome back to Defending Ideas.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here, and greetings from New York.
Sam, I'm excited to have you back because we've talked with you a few times about these issues. You kind of channel insights and expertise in your role as a college professor, as an AEI scholar, and a contributor here at Sutherland Institute. And I really want to dive into a new report that you authored, a new Sutherland report that touches on an issue that I don't think gets talked about a whole lot, and it's this idea of understanding people who identify as having no religious affiliation, but they're not agnostic, they're not atheists, they're just kind of nothing in particular in the identification. So we're going to go through this new report. It's called Talking About Religion in a Secular Age, How Religious Nuns Perceive the Value of Religion. And for those who are listening, nuns meaning N-O-N-E-S, meaning none is their religious preference or affiliation, not religious nuns like N-U-N, just for folks listening only. Got to make that clarification. So, Sam, maybe to start us off, can you just give us some background? Like, what's the purpose of this survey? How is this survey and this report different from previous ways of addressing this issue? How does this help us think differently about studying the role of religion in modern life?
So it's hard to overstate how important this project was. And when we first started talking about it, I actually couldn't sleep. I was really very excited about it. And that's because if you look at religion, if you look at faith, if you look at how people identify over the years, something huge has happened. Decades ago, you would ask folks, what is your faith? And you might have a form of Protestantism, Judaism, LDS, Catholicism, and so on. And you'd have a small number of folks who would say they are none. And, we just sort of throw that away and say, okay, maybe that's 2 or 3% of the electorate, or eventually 5 or 10% of the electorate. When you ask folks about that today, depending on what survey you look at, it could be as high as 45% of the electorate saying that they are nothing. But what does that mean? And if you look at so much research, and this is certainly the case in the Jewish community, we will ask you, what type of Jew are you? And you might say you're conservative, Orthodox, but we also have fair numbers of folks who say they are just Jewish or they're nothing. What is really groundbreaking about this survey is that it not only asks, are you nothing, but it asks you to go a little deeper into that. So we now have a better understanding of this 30 or 40% of the electorate or the polity. Some of them are atheists, some of them are agnostic, and they did a lot of work to get there, to define and explain their atheism and their agnosticism. At the same time, we have a very large number of folks in the survey who say they're none, but they're not atheist or agnostic. They're just nothing. And what we've learned from this is that these are folks who grew up with faith in some capacity. They may have, if you're Jewish, had a bar or bat mitzvah. You may have been consecrated into the church. What has happened now is that these are folks who have drifted. They don't reject faith in religion, but they simply say, I'm really not part of it, so I'm really nothing. Having a chance to jump into this is huge. And the reason, again, is because we've seen this very significant growth in folks who identify as nothing or nuns. And as a college professor, I deal with this all the time. When I wish my students a happy something or other, the number of students who look at me with just confusion it has been increasing year after year after year. And it's not, again, that they're avowed atheists or agnostics. They don't question God or reject God. They're just nothing, and it's not part of their lives. So to have a survey and a project that jumps into this, it's really very, very much a landmark or groundbreaking sort of project. What's also groundbreaking about it and important is that it's not just dipping sort of a stick into the electorate and looking at what was pulled out from the electorate, but we ask some questions of these so-called nuns to get a sense of how rigid are your views? What do you really think about faith? And we can jump into that in a little bit. But basically, when you talk to atheists, agnostics, and nuns, they often say they're very skeptical of religion. They reject it. They don't see it as valuable. What this survey did, when you provide folks who identify as nuns with new information about the role of religion, how important it is in terms of families and community, how important it is in dealing with things like healthcare, disaster relief, homelessness services, the attitudes change. And what's again really very important here is that when you point out to folks who say they've drifted and say, but religion's important in society because we have religious groups, they take care of housing, they take care of homelessness, they take care of providing basic goods and services. Those who have drifted soften their attitudes very, very quickly and realize there's real value here. And that is the other, I would say, second critical finding of the project, which is there's a very strong recognition now over the value of faith for those who are traditionally nuns.
But that's if they're exposed to factual information, right? So can you talk a little bit more about the way the survey approached this, sort of a pre and post intervention where it's one thing to survey people just saying, hey, what do you think about this particular issue? And in this case, those who identify as nothing in particular with a religious affiliation, understanding what their views of religion are. And two, to ask them, well, what would change your mind if you heard different information? That's what seems really insightful to me is, can you talk a little bit more about kind of what's the baseline for someone who says, well, I identify as nothing in particular, and what does a person like that think about religion in public life at baseline? And then what would change their mind to view religion more positively?
Mhm. So that's really the key here. This is an experimental design. So we collect baseline information. We ask lots of folks what they think about the role of faith in society. We understand what their general backgrounds are. And we realize that there's incredible skepticism. There is incredible ignorance about the role of faith and faith-based institutions in society. We then were able to go back to these folks, in particular the ones who say they're nuns, whether they're atheists, agnostics, or something else altogether. We then present them with some new information. That's the treatment and that's the test. And when you present them with this new information and say, hey, there's a lot that we can do here and a lot of value that these institutions provide, what do you then think about the role of faith and faith-based institutions in society? And in many cases, we saw 20 to 30-point jumps of being open to faith-based institutions in society. So when you talk to atheists and agnostics, the numbers don't change all that much. These are folks who've done a lot of thinking. They've drifted, but we don't necessarily know how far they've drifted. They just have a very particular conception of faith. For those who say, I'm not really much of anything and you've drifted, when you reintroduce the potency of religious organizations and say, look, when people need help, when they need food, when they need shelter, when they need clothing, when they need medicine, faith-based organizations do that. The folks who have drifted will pause, reevaluate their perspective, and give you a stronger answer and say, well, maybe faith isn't for me. Maybe it's not something I am exposed to or see or value. But now that I see this data and that I see the role of various faith-based organizations, boy, maybe I've been a little too closed-minded. Maybe I realize that there is real value here. And that's why this is so important. It changes the script for those of us who work in faith-based organizations and institutions to realizing that we need to change our messaging. We need to be very careful and very clear in explaining what we do, why what we do is of value, and why it helps so many people around the nation.
Sam, I want to read an excerpt from the report. It says, while 77% of nuns initially viewed religion as, quote, part of the problem, exposure to factual information about religion's civic contributions produced a 23 percentage point shift, with only 54% maintaining negative views post-intervention. This demonstrates that evidence-based communication can meaningfully influence perceptions even among skeptics. So kind of to drive home the point that you're saying, Is that to say that folks who are agnostic or atheist about religion, that they've sort of already made up their mind about how they view religion in public life, whereas as the religious nuns, those who identify as nothing in particular, are they essentially more persuadable? And if so, why does that matter with sort of the different demographic shifts we're seeing in faith and public life?
Sure. They are more persuadable, and that's what the data does reveal. Now, we'll obviously need to do a lot more work on this area, but I spend a lot of time with various atheists and agnostics as a college professor. I see them all the time. And the reality is to get to those points, in many cases, they've already done some research. They've already spent some time doing some thinking. And in some regards, they've created their own communities around being atheist and agnostic. It takes some real work mentally and emotionally to reject the idea of God entirely, or to constantly question or be skeptical of the idea of God. More often than not, most Americans have, again, simply drifted. And when I talk to students, and I see this again all the time in New York, and again among my students, you have these folks who had something growing up, and again, it's just faded away. It's not that they conscientiously did this, it's that our institutions have declined, and maybe their families are not as connected as they may have been, or they've moved around. These folks have just atrophied. The understanding and appreciation of faith has really thinned out. So they don't reject God or communities of faith whatsoever. They just are not part of them. So that's the real difference here. You realize that they're persuadable and they're open to hearing data and evidence. That's very, very exciting because it means there's an opening there. It may be hard, for instance, to welcome an atheist or agnostic back into a church or into a synagogue. But when it comes to most Americans who just have drifted, it means there's an opening there, and say, hey, you may not, want to join us in the synagogue over some form of religious practice, but please come here and have a dinner with us. Please come here and help deliver food around Thanksgiving or New Year's time. And that's a very, very attractive proposition. It means that there is a lot of room for persuasion, a lot of room for showing value, and a lot of room for showcasing the benefits of religious organizations outside of just prayer, theology, and scripture. And that's very, very exciting to me, and presents, I think, all denominations and all faiths with a very strong mandate that there is an opening and a possibility of still making real connections, which is something that many religious leaders and many professor types have thought have been closed. This survey, by really digging down on the nuns and realizing that the nuns are dynamic, and it's not just atheists, agnostics, and people who reject faith entirely, it says there's a door now open. And my advice to all religious leaders and lay leaders in religious communities is to say there is a possibility here. Let's jump on that, because people are hurting, people need help, people are drifting. We can still provide community and services regardless of whether or not you're in prayer and in religious services with us.
Sam, final question. We just have 30 seconds or so left, but although I want to ask you, help our viewers understand why this matters. I mean, if someone out there is watching or listening to this thinking like, well, who cares if there is a growing demographic that doesn't really feel strongly one way or another in terms of religion? If there's kind of a, live and let live, like, is it a problem if religiosity is declining in society, or if this rise of the demographic religious nuns, so to speak? Help us understand from a societal perspective, do these shifts matter? And if they do, why? And then how does this survey data sort of give us a roadmap as far as what to do about these shifts?
That's really the most important question. And I think the reality is that we are in a loneliness crisis. We've talked about this on the show before. We have low levels of social capital in this country. People are feeling lonely, isolated. They do not feel that they have anywhere to turn to. Institutional trust is in constant decline. You have people who are basically unmoored. Yes, they have their cell phones, but this does not replace human interaction. You have people who may have contacts in social media networks, but these same people say they feel very alone. They have nowhere to turn to. They have no one to talk to. The greatest sort of institution or device we have to repair that is religion and faith, faith-based networks, faith-based communities. When we've surveyed folks who are active in their churches, synagogues, and what have you, we know that these are very engaged, fulfilled people. They do not register anywhere near the levels of feeling as isolated. Levels of suicide, sadly, I hate to talk about it, are much lower. Connectivity levels are much higher. As we have larger numbers of folks saying they are drifting, they are nothing in particular, we have greater amounts of loneliness and social anomie in our society. What this study does for practitioners, thinkers, academics, you name it, shows that there is possibility for movement and growth. And if we want to solve our loneliness crisis, if we want to connect with people, we know how to do it. We've known how to do this for years. Durkheim figured this out over a century ago in Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Religious life, whether it's it's spiritual, practical, i.e. you're praying, or just communal, matters. And this data is so critically important because it shows that those who have drifted, not necessarily atheists or agnostics, but those who are just really nothing, are still open to something. And the data is so strong and gives us a roadmap and says there is a path forward. There's a path to creating more meaning in life. There's a path to creating more connectivity in life. And once I had got my hands on the data, just like I couldn't sleep when we first started talking about it, I couldn't sleep after going through the data, because the data shows that there's a very much open window, and there's a possibility for faith and religion to help society come together again, find more meaning, and for our American populace or polity to be far less lonely and to have far more meaning. And it showcases that when you talk about things in the right sort of way, people are open to it. It doesn't mean we'll bring everyone over. It doesn't mean that churches, synagogues, mosques, what have you, are going to be totally reinvigorated overnight, but it means that people are still persuadable. And that's a very, very nice finding in today's world of polarization.
I love that closing thought. We can still persuade one another in a polarized age. That's actually really encouraging. Sam, we'll leave it there. Again, the report is Talking About Religion in a Secular Age, How Religious Nuns Perceive the Value of Religion by Sam Abrams. Sam, thanks so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to bring on a couple of additional experts to dive into more what this survey data means for society and what we can do about it moving forward. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation about these trends we're seeing in broader society, about how people identify with respect to religious affiliation, and going to introduce a couple of new experts to help us make sense of the report we've been talking about. But first, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can access this and previous episodes and find short clips that you can share on your own social media profiles. And also, if you want to subscribe to Defending Ideas, just search for us wherever you get your shows. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, also on YouTube. Wherever you watch or listen, search for Defending Ideas and click the subscribe button. Again, all that and more wherever you get your shows or defendingideas.org. To continue this conversation, I'm excited to bring into the discussion Dee Allsop in our virtual studio. He's the principal and founder for Heart+Mind Strategies. Dee, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Great to be here, Nick.
And also joining us in the studio, Bill Duncan, Sutherland's Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow. Bill, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
I'm grateful to both of you because in the first segment, we got a great overview from Sam Abrams about this new report, which again, we'll include a link to in the show notes. It's called Talking About Religion in a Secular Age, How Religious Nuns Perceive the Value of Religion. And again, nuns, for those just listening, is N-O-N-E-S, meaning those who do not identify with any particular religious affiliation. And what are we to make sense of these trends? And so to continue the conversation, Dee and Bill, I want to ask both of you, and maybe Dee, we'll start with you. I want to know what you think. What do these findings say about the state of religion today? There's a lot of discussion about declining religiosity, and there are folks who are concerned about that as far as what its effect is on society. So when you look at this survey data, what's just broadly the kind of things that stand out to you for what matters for how we view society and the state of religion today?
Well, thanks, Nick. In my mind, this particular study kind of addresses three really clear kind of places where America is. First, we're very divided about whether or not religion is good or bad for our society. I'm a little over a majority, but mostly we're kind of split on that. Nevertheless, there's really wide support, supermajority saying religious freedom, nevertheless, is important and good for our society. And there's a recognition that there's a lot of good things that society does or that religion does for our society, widespread agreement about that. And the other thing that this study does is that when we give information about the specific things that religious institutions are doing in our society, it actually will change quite significantly that starting question about whether or not religion is good or bad. So when people become informed about the specific things that religious institutions are doing, they actually become much more positive that religion is good for society.
Bill, I want to draw on what Dee just said, sort of this question of, is religion good for society, and get your take on that. I mean, I guess I think someone asked me once, or it came up in conversation, if I were giving advice to younger folks about what to do to have a good life, I'd say, well, finish your education, get a job, get married, have kids, go to church, invest in those civic institutions around you as key parts of your life, and you will most likely be happier and more successful than you would had you not done any of those things. And so I guess I'm kind of coming at this with this bias, if you will, of course religion is good for society, but what do you say? What does the evidence say? And especially for people who maybe are not congregants, either they never were or they are no longer, for folks, whether they believe in a theology or not, how do we talk to them about answering that question? Is religion good for society?
Yeah, that's such a thoughtful question. And it's interesting because I think the framers of the Constitution had the same perception you described, and that is that religion is just inherently good. I mean, they didn't mention it as a subset of some other right. The right to exercise your religion was a standalone right because they recognized that. Part of the challenge, I think, though, is that as something is understood kind of inherently valuable over time, we sometimes lose our ability to articulate, well, why is it valuable? I mean, this is true across a whole range of things. And now I think when almost everything now is in question, we're sort of being forced to think about its value again. So for the framers and for many people of faith, they would say religion is inherently valuable because it's the way that I communicate with God. It's the way that it shapes, everything about me. I think if I was not a religious person and I was trying to think, well, gosh, maybe that's just kind of like a hobby or a fringe topic for other people, what I would want to look at is what it does for the communities where people of faith are engaged. And the evidence is pretty compelling that it has lots of good things. It encourages people to participate more in their communities, not just with others of their same faith, but with everyone. Civic involvement, charitable giving. It allows people to gather together in more effective ways to provide social services, and it motivates people to work for change in society that is positive. Again, not just for those who are religious themselves, but for everyone. And we have some examples, of course, in the report and in other reports we've written on this, and maybe we'll come back and talk about some specific examples. But I think that's part of the answer. For George Washington, he would say that religion provides something essential for government, but which government itself can't provide, and that is sort of that a kind of a call to integrity, to live true to principles like honesty and care for others. So I think that's kind of, we're kind of coming back to the wisdom of the framers in a lot of ways.
Dee, when you think about this growing group, and the report says that it's grown significantly, this demographic that when asked what their religious affiliation or religious preference is, we typically have kind of the standard categories that groups like Pew Research and others have surveyed for a long time. But I think we typically, and this is something Sam said earlier in the report alludes to, we typically think of it as folks who are religious and, Christian, Muslim, various sects of Christianity or any kind of other faith tradition. And then the non-religious category is typically thought of as agnostic or atheist or something like that. But this other category of none or nothing in particular, it's kind of a new thing. And looking at the data in the report, that even just in the last 3 or 4 decades, it's grown from somewhere around 7% to 28%. I mean, it's extremely fast as far as its expansion. What do you make of that, and why is it important for us to understand that group?
That's a really good point. Over my lifetime, it's gone from almost zero, near zero, to now about almost 30%, just under 30%, who are not affiliated with any religious group. That's a sizable group. That's larger than most religious traditions in the country. But just like we study a lot about the different types of faith traditions, and as you talked about them, there's a lot of Christian, non-Christian, Jewish types of different religious traditions. Nuns are not all alike either. There's some very different types of groups there, and they act differently. Some are nuns because they just never had an interest. Some are because they had a bad experience and they got negative toward it. Some are just doing so good in life they don't need God. So there's a whole variety of different types of nuns out there, and they have different feelings about God. And there's even a group of them who just are not close to God, but they want to get back close to God. So you have to think of them as very individual types of people, each on their own kind of journey in this relationship with God and with religious institutions.
One thing I'd love to get your take on as well is again, sort of approaching this from sort of if I'm approaching this from kind of the non-academic standpoint, if I'm just a guy out there who's hearing this and thinking, well, if I want a strong, vibrant, healthy society, I want more people in the pews, so to speak, not less. I want more people sort of acting motivated by a sense of a responsibility to the divine and to each other, and all the ways that Bill has talked about and written about, where it motivates us to serve one another, to act differently in really powerful ways. So I would think of it as, well, I want more people to be religious in the United States. I want more people to have a strong connection with faith and faith institutions. Is that wrong, I guess, in 2026 to say? Or is there anything about this data that can help if I say, well, that's a goal. I want faith to have a strong role in public life and in all of our personal lives. What from this data should I extrapolate to help either to refine or improve or operationalize that viewpoint?
Again, good question. In my mind, I kind of look at it slightly different. There's this idea of religious conversion, which is this personal spiritual change of heart where you become affiliated not just in your actions, but in your soul to a faith orientation and belief. But there's another large group, which I think is just equally important, who aren't necessarily going to be about a spiritual religious conversion, but a recognition that's really explicit of why, even though I'm not a believer, I recognize that believers and religion and faith make important contributions to our society and need to be protected. And in my mind, this study really is about that second group. There's a lot of things that, even though you're not a believer or right now, or maybe not in your near future, there's still reasons why it's really important to recognize and support what religions and faith groups do in our communities. And there's a lot of data here that just shows a lot of that is just making it more clear, just more explicitly, what are the number of things they're doing in terms of hospital beds, in terms of education, in terms of the careers created at religious institutions, making the people in religious institution college are more likely to go into careers that help others. So what are those concrete benefits that I, as a non-believer, say, wow, that's helping my society, my community? Just as you make those things more known to people, they are far more likely to be supporting the role of faith in their community.
Dee, let's dive into that. We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to dive into what you just said and expand a little bit, because I think it can give us a roadmap for how to talk about this. And I like what you said, that we're expanding we're casting a wider net, if you will, essentially saying to folks that, whether or not you believe in a particular theological identity, you still should recognize the good, just empirically, that faith does for society, and recognize it has a role. It should have religious freedom protections. So I want to expand on that a little bit and see if we can sort of turn that into some action items for our audience. So let's take a quick break. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation with Dee Allsop from Heart+Mind Strategies and Sutherland's Bill Duncan. I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing, subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you get your shows, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. You can also find us at defendingideas.org. Dee and Bill, there's something we touched on in the last segment that I want to expand on a little bit. And Dee, it was something that you said, this idea that if I approach this issue as saying, well, I want more people to be religious, and I think that's good for society. But then you, I think, appropriately said, well, but there's sort of a broader thing we're trying to do. There's a different thing we're trying to do with this survey data, which is there are a lot of people out there in the United States that are not currently religious in terms of like theological belief or participation in a faith institution. And what this survey data shows us is that even if they are not going to, per se, participate in a faith institution, we can still persuade them to support the existence of faith institutions as playing a role in public life and being deserving of religious freedom protections. So can you expand on that a little bit, that if for me or other leaders, how do we operationalize that? What should we be saying?
I think this is a big kind of, kind of the importance of what we're talking about here. Not in this study, but in many studies that we've done and others, there is a huge lack of institutional trust. We don't trust our institutions that have led us in society. That includes our Congress, our elected officials, etc. And it seems from the data we have here that people overwhelmingly believe that faith and religious institutions play these fundamental roles. So by that belief, it is inherent that there is a trust. So I look at this in the context of, if there's this existing trust in faith to provide disaster relief, security for those in need, and other types of social services, why doesn't government and our community leaders more actively work to partner with faith-based organizations in the providing of these services? The structures are there, the trust is there, and I think they can have a very significant impact in those types of things that are needed.
Bill, I want to ask you, if I have a hypothetical conversation with somebody, if they ask, Nic, why are you a member of your religious faith? Why do you like that? Why do you think it's good? I think it's common, sort of the common response for a member of a church or a faith organization is to sort of speak to the personal, the spiritual. It helps me feel connected with God and a more loving husband and father, those kinds of very personal theological, I would make a spiritual argument for religion if somebody asked me, well, Nic, why are you in it? Why do you think it's good? Should I do less of that and do more of, look at all the good that churches do for, as Dee is saying, for disaster relief, for housing the homeless, for healthcare, stuff that you've written on extensively. Do I need to be better at articulating those points if my goal is to increase support and respect for faith institutions?
I don't think the answer is to necessarily do less, but to make sure that you do get eventually to that point. Partially, one of the reasons that religion plays the powerful role it does is that it's not just an instrumental value. It's not just a way to try and convince people to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. It really does spring up from the commitment within a person that comes because, like Dee described earlier, from a true conviction. And you can't just duplicate that in some other way. It's almost magical in a way. Maybe that's probably the wrong word to say, but you know that a sincere belief that someone has can affect them in such a way as that they're those around them are affected as well. And I think that may be the way to describe that, to say here, why I personally believe what I do is this, and the experiences I've had and what I've come to feel or know is true. And it's as a result, one of the things I see in my own life and I see in people around me in my faith community is the following. And I love what Dee said. I really can't say enough good about the work that he and his colleagues did on this survey. It's really, really helpful, very well constructed, and gives us great data. And I loved his point that one of the things that we can take from this is that the next thing after you've made that explanation is to say, and because of my faith, I really care deeply about these things, which I think you care about as well. And I bet we could work together in a way that would really make a difference in our community. Or, I think that's probably maybe one of the things that stood out to me most in this. Well, a lot of things stood out to me in this report. It really was well done. Again, the survey was well constructed, but I think that's an important take-home message, that there's a lot more work that can be done with collaboration based on what we know here.
Nic, let me add to that. Often you learn things that you can do, but in this case, we also learn some things you shouldn't do, particularly with the nuns. It turns if you're not a religiously affiliated person, it really is a turnoff to tell them that religion is going to make them happier or a better person. That's just kind of a non-starter for them. And it's a lot better if instead of that, because it's a judgment on them as a person to start with, just to state the obvious. Instead of that, if we talk about how what Bill just said, how we can work together to make things better in our community, and then we are actively engaging in that, we're showing by our actions that same kind of thought of that faith can make not just you, but our entire society and our community better. And that's just a much more effective way, and it doesn't start with a turnoff.
Dee, that's really compelling to me, because I'm grappling with this a little bit. I'll be honest, because I think, okay, my religious faith, it does make me happier and a better person. And if I do think, well, for someone else, it would make them a happier and better person. So I'm kind of sorting through that. But to your point, this idea of, I think of something Yuval Levin has said often, AEI scholar, friend of Sutherland, and just an amazing national voice on the importance of institutions and the Constitution. His latest book is all about the Constitution. And maybe in this divided age, as the report says, the title is talking about religion in a secular age, that we need to be better at. We need to dial up our skill set at talking about how religion, how faith institutions can be part of the civic ecosystem that we're all part of. And the way Yuval Levin describes it is, and Bill, you might be able to correct me on this, it's something along the lines of acting together even when you disagree. So thinking differently, but acting together. Maybe the survey kind of gives us a roadmap, Dee, that if you're an elected leader, a religious leader, just a parent, just a person, to think, well, at the end of the day, yes, we want anyone who wants to be part of a faith institution and talk about its benefits, we need them to have the freedom to do that. But societally, it's just fundamentally good for faith to be a part of life and to have religious freedom protections and to work together with other people to feed the poor, address homelessness, disaster relief, education, healthcare. Can you boil that down into maybe a script, if you will? If I'm talking to somebody who's in this religious nun category and they're kind of skeptical of religion, and my goal is to persuade them that faith is a good thing for society, what are some specific messages that I should say to them to make them think, oh, okay, like I may not believe still, but I respect and appreciate what faith does? What can I say?
Another thing to just kind of contextualize this is part of the reason that there's nearly half the people who think that religion is bad for our society is because of the divisiveness that it creates, the judgment of I'm better than you, or this religion's better than that religion, etc. If in its place, we are working collaboratively with faith groups and other folks to do the things that our society needs, it sends the complete opposite message. that we are the ones solving the problems, working together, overcoming differences, things that our society is hungry for, or who's modeling those kinds of behaviors. And so in my mind, that's where we are as we get into active, work with those that are different than us and doing the things that we share in common, which are many, to help make a bigger difference in society. That's how we spread the message that faith is good in our society.
And maybe if I can just add one thing, one of the most important messages, I know I've said this about other things too, so there's a lot of important messages here, but one that really I think is a source of great hope is that as people understand what Dee just described, they significantly change their opinions about what religion does for society. They become much more open to the characterization of religion as a good for society, as a good for communities. So what Dee described is exactly right and will work. That's one of the things that we learned from this project.
And Dee, if I can give you the last word, that's essentially one of the biggest takeaways to me from this survey data is that there are specific facts and evidence that we can articulate that will elevate people's understanding of the societal good across all these domains: disaster relief, helping the poor and homeless, healthcare, education. I mean, all kinds of things that when they understand some of the statistics and just irrefutable evidence on those things, it does literally shift their perception of religion and public life. Any final thoughts on that being a really important takeaway from this that we can then use?
It's not in the nature of religious institutions to toot their own horn. That's just not in the nature of them. So it's largely up to people of faith to get involved doing these things in their own lives and in sharing those stories and those successes with a broader and broader circle. So that's just kind of one additional point on there.
Well, we will leave it there. We're at time. This is excellent. Everyone needs to go and read this report and look at the survey data, and let's think about how to incorporate it to have the more healthy, vibrant civic culture I think deep down inside we all want to act together to solve some of these problems. So again, Dee Allsop, Heart+Mind Strategies, thank you so much. And Sutherland's Bill Duncan, thank you both for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to take one final break before we leave you with some talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back, and special thanks to Sam Abrams, Bill Duncan, and Dee Allsop for sharing their insights about this new survey data. From this conversation, the big question on my mind is, how can I play a role in conversations to persuade more people to support the presence of faith institutions in public life and to support religious freedom protections in the law? And I'm going to be honest, some of the advice from our guests still has me thinking, because I do believe strongly and have seen evidence in my own life that religious faith has real personal benefits related to happiness, character, and more. But the evidence that our guests profiled today show that if you and I want to be truly persuasive to those who are skeptical of religion, we also need to be willing to share messages and insights that the evidence shows will actually be persuasive. So the next time you find yourself in a conversation with someone who's skeptical about whether religion is a force for good in modern life, share some of these facts. Faith-based organizations provide most emergency shelter services. Religion contributes $1.2 trillion annually to the U.S. economy. Nearly 75% of FEMA disaster relief organizations are faith-based. There are many more facts in the report, again, linked in the show notes. The research shows that sharing these kinds of facts actually shifts the attitudes of religion skeptics to think more favorably about the presence, role, and religious freedom protections of faith institutions. You and I should always remain true to our convictions about what has helped shape us, while also acknowledging in our unique secular age that we can become better at persuading skeptics in a way that will build true consensus. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed the discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Make sure to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it valuable. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.